Hello and welcome to Atlantic Springs Church Services. I am your host, Pastor Stephen, and I am so happy that you've taken some time out of your busy day to join us. We are a non-denominational, spirit contemporary church whose goal it is to bring you the word and teachings of Jesus Christ in a refreshing and relevant way. Each week, the message will be delivered by a different pastor or minister from within the Christian faith. This week's message, Enemies of the Heart, is brought to you from Harbour Church, Portsmouth, England, by Reverend Alex Wood. Until next time, may the good Lord bless you and keep you, and may his face shine upon you. Amen.
Between us, by the cross you came and broke them down. You broke them down. And there were chains around us. By your grace we are no longer bound, no longer bound. You called me out of the grave, you called me into the light. You called my name and then my heart came alive. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. Oh, 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 oh. Feel the darkness shaking, all the dead are coming back to life. I'm back to life, and hear the song awakening, all creation singing, we're alive, 'cause you're alive. You called me out of the grave, you called me into the light. You called my name and then my heart came alive. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. And what a love we found, death can't hold us down. We shout it out, we're alive, 'cause you're alive. And what a love we found, death can't hold us down. We shout it out, we're alive, 'cause you're alive. And what a love we found, death can't hold us down. We shout it out, we're alive, 'cause you're alive. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. Your love awakens me. Your love is greater, your love is stronger. Your love awakens, awakens, awakens me. Praise you, God. Lift you up today. Thank you, Jesus. You are risen, Savior. Oh, we lift you up, God. Presence, Jesus.
You were the Word at the beginning, one with God the Lord Most High. Your hidden glory in creation, now revealed in you are Christ. What a beautiful name it is. What a beautiful name it is. The name of Jesus Christ, my King. What a beautiful name it is. Nothing compares to this. What a beautiful name it is. The name of Jesus. You didn't want heaven without us, so Jesus, you brought heaven down. My sin was great, your love was greater. What
Good morning, everybody. So great to be with you. I'm really looking forward to preaching this morning. But before I begin, just a quick health warning. If you are here with a child, or you yourself don't want to know some behind-the-scenes information about Santa Claus, I would say now is the time to go to a kid's room. If you're watching online at home, and again, you don't want to know some behind-the-scenes information about Santa Claus, now's the time to cover your children's ears. Or if you yourself think, I don't know what you might be talking about, maybe you should go to the baby room yourselves. So anyway, today, as Catherine mentioned, I'm going to be continuing our series on greed, and we're talking about enemies of the heart. If you've got a Bible, you might need that later, but don't worry, we are going to be looking at it on the screen, so don't worry about that if you don't have one with you. This week I was in a city called Bari in southern Italy, which I was there sort of making a documentary, a Christmas special, which is going to be airing on the 23rd of December, looking at all the meaning behind some of the traditions that we celebrate at Christmas, like why do we really have a Christmas tree? Who is this guy, Santa Claus? Why do kids up and down the country put tea towels on their heads and wear dressing gowns and do school plays? What is really going on with all of those things? But when I was in Italy, I had gone to discover the truth behind the character Santa Claus. And I'm delighted to be able to confirm to everybody in the room, and in fact to myself, that Santa Claus is real. I saw him for myself, and even had a historical theologian explain to me exactly who he was, where he came from, and all the details. I will say, and I did say, spoiler, he's dead. He's dead. But again, so sorry. The way I explained it to my 8-year-old is I went to see the first Santa Claus, and if you've seen the film Arthur Christmas, you will know that being Santa Claus passes down the generations. So he's just the first Santa Claus, who is now, his bones are buried in southern Italy. I don't know if that bit went down very well. I'd sort of got myself stuck in a sort of weird dead end with my daughter. But he was a real guy. He was a 3rd century bishop. He lived in modern-day Turkey. It was called Asia Minor back then. And he was sort of in charge of that local area. He was a Christian. And when he died in about 300 AD, and then later on, when the area of Asia Minor where he was buried was being taken over, some Christians from Italy went and they stole his bones and took them back to this city in southern Italy. And then they built a massive church over the top. And his bones are buried in a sarcophagus in a crypt, also known as a grotto, underneath the church. And weirdly, really bit of weird, gross information, once a year, on the 9th of May, they take a syringe and they syringe out his juice that is created every year. And then they add it to water and make a substance called myrrh. That's pretty gross, isn't it? Yeah, anyway, some real behind-the-scenes stuff about Santa. So sorry if you're watching online or watching again later, finding out these gory details. But he was basically a really generous man, and he made a huge difference, and he became a saint. He was canonized in the Middle Ages because the stories of his life were so significant that he's been remembered for the last 1800 years. And there's one such story of a moment when in the local area there was a nobleman who had 3 daughters, and the oldest daughter was about to be married. And in the time, if you couldn't afford your children, it was relatively common practice to sell your children into slavery. And so this nobleman couldn't afford the dowry for his oldest daughter to get married. And so he was planning to sell her into slavery. And actually, with this daughter, it would have been selling her into a life of prostitution. And in the middle of the night, St. Nicholas went to the house and dropped a bag of gold through the window, just enough to cover her dowry. So the oldest daughter could then get married and use this gold as her dowry. And then the nobleman's second daughter came to get married, and the same thing happened. She was due to be sold into slavery. St. Nicholas came in the middle of the night, dropped a bag of gold through the window, and again, she then had enough money to pay for her dowry. And then the third daughter was due to get married, but they didn't have enough money for the dowry, and she was due to be sold into slavery. And St. Nicholas came, went to drop the bag of gold through the window, and it accidentally dropped into a stocking that was hanging by the fire to dry. And so that's why we hang stockings, by the fire to dry. Who even knew? My mind was... Hands up if you did know. Oh, well done, you guys. Well done. I don't know if you really did. You just wanted to look like you did. But anyway, that's hence why we have that tradition. And we were uncovering some other traditions like that. Santa is real, and now we know why we're hanging up stockings by the fire to dry, so that he drops gold coins, perhaps, in the middle of the night into our stockings. St. Nicholas was this man who was known for his generosity. He became the patron saint of children because he cared about children and valued their lives. He's the patron saint of Russia, and he's remembered for practicing generosity, for being somebody who gave out of the surplus that he had. And Christmas is a time when we remember how blessed it is to give gifts to other people, that we are reenacting what St. Nicholas did in his life. Here at Harbour Church, for example, we're making these hampers of hope to deliver all over PO1 and to the local area, because at Christmas we remember that generosity is something that each one of us can practice. But generosity, I guess, isn't always the story of this time of year. It was Black Friday on Friday. Hands up if anybody got any good bargains on Friday. Oh, well done. Very good. And I guess the thing is with Black Friday is both the best day of the year, but also the day of the year when you think it's awful to be a human, as you sort of like get to the shops and elbow somebody in the face to try and get to a bargain because you absolutely need that extra quarter zip hoodie that you sort of like were desperate to get because you think it's going to change your life. And Christmas, I guess, as it gets more commercialized, is also less about generosity and more about overconsumption, as Kath starts eating mince pie by the dozen for her breakfast, and other people, it's not just food, but it's financial. It's going to that Christmas party and over-consuming and then being too nervous to go to work the next day because you're worried about what you did. And although the season is about radical generosity and giving, somewhere along the line it's become a little bit about overconsumption. And in this series, over the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at emotions that bubble out of us that we want to be able to control or identify why they're bubbling out of us. 2 weeks ago, we looked at anger. Last week, Liz looked at anger. And 2 weeks ago, Andrew looked at guilt. If I'm honest, when I was thinking about this, I can recognize guilt and anger as emotions that from time to time bubble out into my life. And I recognize that the practices of forgiveness and confession as antidotes to those emotions would be quite helpful in my life. But I just don't feel that greed is like a big issue. Like every now and again, I sort of put the kids to bed and stuff my face with chocolate. But like I sort of think, it's not like a spiritual sin that I'm like carrying around with me. I'm not like wandering around thinking the one area of my life where I need to really tackle is greed. And so it was really helpful for me to look at this Bible passage to understand what is meant and why this is an important topic for all of us to look at. So we're going to look at the Bible together. We're going to look at Luke chapter 12, verse 13 to 21. It should come up on the screen. Very good. And I'm going to read it along in this Bible, and then we're going to leave it up because we're going to go through it together. It's the parable of the rich fool. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." Of the four enemies of the heart, greed is the most subtle of all. And at the root of greed is fear. Fear is the driving force behind greed, because people with greed lodged in their hearts fear that God won't or can't take care of them. And if God won't or can't take care of them, then who will? And greed isn't just financial, it isn't just to do with food or belongings. An attitude of greed is one that holds on to stuff, constantly desiring more, is looking for the next thing to make them feel whole and won't give it away. Because for greedy people, there's always another what if that drives them to acquire more. Their appetites can't be satisfied, so they never feel like they quite have enough, which of course is the very thing that a greedy person fears most of all. I'm sort of beginning to recognize myself a tiny bit more than I was at the beginning. But let's look at this passage together. I want to just go through a few lines of this passage. So picture the scene. Just before, in the earlier part of chapter 12, we've discovered that crowds are beginning to gather. And in fact, Luke, the writer of this passage, for the last couple of paragraphs, has created this sense of like building momentum. As Jesus moves around what is now Israel, Palestine, more and more people are turning up to hear and to listen to what he's got to say. Crowds and crowds of people. And by this time, we realize that there are thousands of people gathered to hear him. So actually, if you picture the scene, Jesus is either in a local village just outside, possibly like in an amphitheater, or just in the corner of a worshipful space, or even in a field. And thousands of people had gathered to hear this teacher, to hear what he's saying. And into that context, some bloke interrupts the whole thing, goes, "Oi, tell my brother to share his inheritance with me." And Jesus, which I really like, well, although I've made it sound ludicrous, it was relatively common practice for people to take their financial grievances to a rabbi so that the rabbi could then judge. And in fact, many rabbis would travel from village to village to enact justice or to settle disputes between people. But Jesus' reply isn't to say, "Okay, let's hear what the story is, let me help you." Instead, and there are two ways of reading this, he says, "Man, who appointed me judge or arbiter between you?" Or what I like to think, "Man, who appointed me judge or arbiter between you?" And then he said, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." As ever, Jesus refuses to answer the question literally and do what the guy is asking him to do and to explain who should get the inheritance, and instead goes right to the heart, to the root of the problem, and says, "The question that you're asking has a much deeper heart problem that I want to address with you right now." He's not saying I don't know the answer or I don't have the authority to answer, but instead he turns it into an issue of the heart. He's looking at the motivation behind the question. And it's always the way with Jesus. We think we're going to him for one thing, and he says, actually, it's not your anger that you need to deal with. It's the reason behind the anger that I want to look at. It's not your greed that's the problem. It's what is going on in your heart that I want to deal with. Jesus says life isn't about possessions. It's about so much more. So in order to teach into this area, Jesus tells them a story, a parable, not something that really happened, but a story to help them understand and to engage with this topic of greed. A parable that is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago when Jesus first told the story. So we've got a rich man, so we know he was already wealthy, which is an important part of the story, and he had an abundant harvest. We also know, and they would have known hearing this, that this abundant harvest wasn't because he'd been really clever with the sort of pesticides he'd sprayed on the ground that year, or because he'd bought a new combine harvester, or because he'd watched Jeremy Clarkson's farm and thought, you know what, I've got some top tips here that I can enact to get more wheat out of the ground. They would have known that an abundant harvest was a blessing from God, because actually abundant harvests are usually due to the weather conditions and things outside of the control of a farmer. So God has given him an abundant harvest. Really important to remember that it comes from God. He can't take the credit for having an abundant harvest. We then find out that he doesn't have enough space to store all of the abundant harvest, which means that he has a decision to make. What do I do with this surplus? So he's faced with a dilemma. There's not like a sort of obvious narrative, like obviously if this, then that. He's faced with this question: what should I do with this surplus that I have? And despite having a multiple different options of what he could do, he decides to tear down his barns, build bigger barns to store his surplus. And he justifies it by saying, I've got lots of stuff stored up for years to come. And then he says, I shall be able to eat, drink, and be merry. Which is a common phrase that we use now. Interestingly, it was a phrase that they used back then: eat, drink, and be merry. But it would have had a familiarity to the hearers of this story, and it would have had really negative connotations because it was linked to the idea of a hedonistic lifestyle, which was something that Jewish people didn't value. So it's like sort of saying, I'll get wasted and have a really great time and do a lot of drugs. And if we said that now, we'd be like, oh, it doesn't sound like the best idea for your life. It would have been more like him saying that. And into this story, into this parable, when this guy says, I shall eat, drink, and be merry, it says God spoke to the man. Again, it's a story rather than a literal thing. It says God steps in and calls him, you fool. And the word fool in the original Greek is a word called aphron. And it's not used lightly, but it's a word from the Old Testament of someone who rejects the knowledge and teachings of God. So there is a way to do life, a way that flows with the spirit of what God intends for your life, a way that if you live like this, you will live at peace and you will live in the blessings of God. And a fool is someone who's basically walking upstream against all of the ideas of how God teaches you to live. And so he says, you fool. And actually, it would have harked back to some teaching earlier on. We find it in Matthew, but the hearers would have heard Jesus teaching something, and he taught a few chapters before and said, do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth. These are words that Jesus had already said. So him being a fool is saying, you're basically ignoring the advice I've given you. I've told you, do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth. You're doing exactly the opposite. And I'm saying because of that, you're not living the best life that I've got for you. And then God says to the man that he will lose his life and all that he's lived for will be lost. And I don't think that Jesus is using this parable to say, be on guard, because if you are someone who saves money and has money in the bank, you'll die immediately and everything that you have will be given to inheritance tax. I don't think that's what he's saying. It's not a warning saying you will die a very sudden death. What he's saying is if you make your life about possessions, you're always only moments away from losing the entire meaning of your life. Because this guy correlated the meaning and the purpose of his life with what he'd accumulated. His value and his identity was found in his stuff, not in who he was or his relationship with God. So the message is pretty clear. Firstly, that greed is based on fear. Fear that someone isn't looking out for you, not trusting God. So you accumulate stuff for yourselves to try and make yourself feel safe. Because that's the truth. When I flick open my bank balance on my phone, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be okay. My bank balance is what I go to think I'm going to get to the end of the month and things will be okay. I don't flick open my Bible and say, things will be okay. I flick open my Monzo and think, yeah, I'm going to be able to buy Starbucks. It's going to be okay. Greed says, I owe me. I'm going to get myself some more stuff because I've got to look out for myself. So that's the first thing. And secondly, it's clear that God doesn't want you to live like that. That's not his best plan for my life and for your life. He thinks it's foolish to make our lives about stuff, to operate out of fear and to keep a surplus for ourselves. So what's the solution that God is offering? Well, firstly, there's quite a simple solution and quite a direct one. And I would say that Jesus did intend this to be understood literally. And for us today, there's a literal interpretation of this, which is that this man who was already wealthy had an abundant harvest, and it gave him not only enough for what he needed, but it gave him a surplus. And the antidote to greed is generosity. So the antidote to this idea of greed, which is more than just stuffing your face, which is like a heart problem, the antidote is generosity. And this is where I really recognize myself. So our consumer-driven culture keeps us laser-focused on what we don't have. And focusing on what we don't have leaves our hearts vulnerable to greed because it makes us constantly dissatisfied with what we have, with what we've got right now. And it's true of clothes and belongings and a house and money and Instagram followers and everything. It might be different in your life what you're focused on not having than what I'm focused on not having. But all of us, society keeps us focused on what we don't have, and it makes us dissatisfied with what we've got right now. But the truth is, and not for everybody, and not certainly for everyone in Portsmouth, but for most of us, we have everything that we need. And so the question is, what should we do with our surplus? Because we have a choice. We have a choice to either build bigger barns and keep chasing the next upgrade, the next purchase, the next thing that might finally make us feel like we've got everything we need, trapped in this cycle of unfulfillment. But as ever, Jesus offers us a different and more fulfilling way to live, because what he's offering us is freedom from this cycle, freedom from dissatisfaction, and freedom from a lack of peace. Because if you believe that your surplus is given to you by God, like the farmer can't control the yield of his crop, then maybe God has given it to you for a reason. Maybe God gave you that surplus for a reason. God has given you more than you need so that you might be able to be generous and to give it away. And I think that is the literal interpretation of this Bible passage. That this Christmas, I wonder if you think about what you need and what the surplus is really for. And you could pray and say, God, what do you want me to use this for? What could I do with this? And so that's the simple and literal interpretation. Sorry that it's not more exciting. Okay, cool. Better give something away then. But there is something else, which if you don't want to take that away, I would recommend you do. You can take this next thing away. Because the clue into the deeper heart issue is found in the next passage. Because the next passage begins with, therefore. So he's told this story, and then in the next passage he says, therefore. And this is a well-known passage that we would stick on a fridge magnet and put it on our fridge. It's, do not worry about your life, what you will eat. Life is more than just food or clothes. Consider the lilies of the field, the birds of the air. How much more does God love you? Your Father knows what you need. Seek his kingdom and all will be given to you. So he tells the parable and then he says, therefore, do this. Be aware that the most important, the more profound message is, do you not realize that God is going to give you everything that you possibly need? Do not make your life about your life or your stuff, but it will never lead to peace. Peace is a fruit of the Spirit, not a byproduct of accumulated wealth. And if you want to experience peace in your life, give your life and your ambitions away and center your life on building the kingdom of heaven wherever you are. Then you will gain your whole life. You will find peace and you'll break this cycle of forever feeling like you're waiting for the next thing to bring you peace. We celebrate Santa this time of year, and it's because he lived this extraordinarily generous life. Also, we can celebrate Santa now. If you ever thought, like, is that a Christian thing I'm supposed to do? I would say, we're not into Father Christmas, we're into Santa Claus, Santa Nicolaus. Yeah, really good. But what we're really celebrating, Santa is just a pale imitation of the person who gave us everything. That Jesus gave us everything to save our lives. And when we remember this time of year, that the creator of every possession that you could ever have, of all the stars in the sky, which are more numerous than grains of sand on earth, the person who was there in the beginning before anything existed and spoke life into being, at Christmas we remember that he came to earth and humbled himself that much to live with us so that he might be close to us. That's the truth of the message of this season, that someone loved you so much that they gave you everything. And then he said, I will always give you everything that you need. So you don't need to worry about storing up for yourself everything that you need. Instead, you can be sure that everything that you could possibly ever need is found in Jesus. It's found in this person that gave everything for you. So if you don't want to take the first message away, that you need to now go and find who to give all your money to, take the second message away and say, I can be free from this constant sense of slight dissatisfaction and chasing after enough stuff to make me feel whole. And instead remember that God says, I've given you a better and a new way to live. One way you will find everything that you need in this person, Jesus, who came to be with you.
Well, that's a wrap. We hope you enjoyed the service. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.